The winter of 1814 had closed the door on Napoleon Bonaparte, or so Europe believed. Exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba after years of continent-wide war, the once invincible emperor was meant to live out his days in quiet isolation, watched over by allied guards and forgotten by the thrones he had shaken. Yet France itself had not forgotten. The Bourbon monarchy, restored under Louis XVIII, was viewed by many veterans and citizens as weak and foreign, a symbol of humiliation rather than stability. And in February 1815, with audacity that stunned Europe, Napoleon slipped past his captors and landed on the French coast with a handful of loyal men. As he marched north toward Paris, soldiers sent to arrest him instead fell to their knees, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" Within weeks, the old order was overturned once more. This astonishing return, which came to be known as the 100 Days, threw the European powers into panic. The ink on the treaties that had ended the Napoleonic Wars was barely dry, and now the man they had sacrificed millions to defeat was again gathering armies. The coalition that had once crushed him, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, moved quickly to reform. They vowed to put him down not just as a ruler, but as a threat to the entire European balance. But Napoleon knew the vast alliance needed time to assemble its scattered forces. He also knew time was the one resource he still controlled. If he could strike swiftly, crushing the nearest enemy armies before they could unite, he might yet dictate terms from a position of strength. His plan was daring and simple. 2 coalition armies, the Anglo-Allied force under British commander Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, were massing in Belgium, close enough to threaten northern France but separated by a day's march. Napoleon resolved to drive a wedge between them, defeat each in turn, and then negotiate peace from a position of power. His veterans, hardened by years of campaigns from Austerlitz to Wagram, rallied once more under the Imperial Eagle. In May 1815, nearly 124,000 men of the Armée du Nord crossed the frontier toward Belgium. On the other side of the border, Wellington was still organizing a patchwork army. His force was a coalition in itself. British regulars stood alongside Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, many of them inexperienced or untested in battle. Wellington, however, was no stranger to fighting against the odds. His campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula had proven his genius for defensive warfare and his ability to hold firm under relentless pressure. He knew Napoleon would strike hard and fast, and he knew the key was to stand firm long enough for Blücher's Prussians to join the fight. The 2 commanders could not have been more different. Napoleon was impulsive, charismatic, and bold, a master of rapid maneuver who sought decisive battle above all else. Wellington was methodical, cautious, and deeply pragmatic, relying on terrain, discipline, and timing. Yet both understood that what was coming would decide not just the fate of their armies, but the political future of Europe itself. If Napoleon triumphed, the coalition might fracture and his empire could rise again. If he failed, his rule, and perhaps his life, would be over. By mid-June, the storm was gathering. Napoleon struck first, defeating Blücher at Ligny on June 16th, but failing to destroy his army. At the same time, a fierce fight at Quatre-Bras against Wellington's advance forces ended inconclusively, but the Allies held their ground long enough to prevent the French from separating them completely. Blücher's battered army retreated northward in good order, and Wellington began pulling back toward a position he had scouted days earlier, a gentle ridge south of a small Belgian village called Waterloo. It was here that he intended to make his stand. The ground offered subtle but vital advantages. The slope would shield his troops from French artillery fire, and a series of strong points, farmhouses, hedgerows, and sunken lanes, would anchor his flanks. Behind him lay the road to Brussels, the political heart of the coalition's effort. In front of him, Napoleon's army would have to climb and fight uphill against a foe determined to hold. The world watched as 2 titans of the age prepared for their final confrontation. Napoleon, once the master of Europe, sought one last gamble to reclaim his destiny. Wellington, the unflappable defender, gathered a multinational force to stop him. As the rain poured over the Belgian countryside on the night of June 17th, soldiers on both sides huddled in the mud, their fates tied to decisions made by men they would never meet. The stage was set. The road to Waterloo was nearly at its end, and the dawn would bring the battle that would decide the future of Europe. The chandeliers of the Élysée Palace had barely been rehung before Napoleon Bonaparte began to plan for war once again. It was as if the 9 months of exile had been nothing more than a pause, a deep breath before the storm resumed. France was weary but electrified. Across the nation, veterans returned to their regiments, artisans abandoned their workshops, and the imperial eagles were raised once more above barracks and arsenals. The emperor's enemies, kings and emperors who had once sworn to end his rule forever, were already on the march. But Napoleon had no intention of waiting for them to come. If Europe was to destroy him again, it would have to do so in Belgium, on ground of his choosing, under conditions he set. The War Council he convened in early June 1815 was small but decisive. Marshals and staff officers gathered around maps that stretched across the polished tables, their hands tracing the roads and rivers of the Low Countries. Napoleon spoke without flourish. There was no room for grand rhetoric now. Every hour was precious. Our enemies are numerous, he admitted, but they are scattered. If we wait, they will unite. If we strike first, we divide them and defeat them separately. His plan was a masterpiece of speed and audacity, a final demonstration of the principles that had once made him the terror of Europe. The coalition armies were assembling, but still disjointed. To the east, Field Marshal Blücher's Prussian army, roughly 120,000 strong, was concentrated around Namur and Ligny. To the west and slightly north, the Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington, about 110,000 men, was stationed near Brussels and Nivelles. Between them lay a gap of roughly a day's march. That gap was Napoleon's opportunity. If he could push his 124,000-strong army due north swiftly into Belgium, he could drive a wedge between the two forces before they could unite. He would then turn and crush one army before wheeling to destroy the other. Napoleon knew the risks. His army was smaller than the combined forces of the coalition, and French resources were stretched thin after years of war. The veterans of the Grand Army were gone, many buried in Russia or Spain, and the men now wearing blue were a mixture of hardened old soldiers and eager but untested recruits. But what the army lacked in numbers it could make up for in speed. Napoleon's greatest weapon had always been his ability to move quickly, to force the enemy to react to him rather than the other way around. On June 14, 1815, the anniversary of his great victory at Marengo, the French army began its advance. They crossed the Sambre River with precision, their movements concealed by cavalry screens and local support. By June 15th, they had penetrated deep into Belgian territory, moving faster than the coalition expected. The Allied High Command was caught off guard. Wellington was still attending a ball in Brussels when news arrived that the French had crossed the frontier. "Napoleon has humbugged me, by God," he is said to have muttered, realizing too late that the emperor had stolen the initiative. The next phase of the plan unfolded exactly as Napoleon intended. He split his forces into three main elements. Marshal Ney was to engage and pin down Wellington's army to the west, preventing them from reinforcing the Prussians. Napoleon himself, with the main body of the army, would fall upon Blücher's forces near the village of Ligny. Once the Prussians were destroyed or routed, he would turn west to deal with Wellington before the British and their allies could withdraw or entrench. The Battle of Ligny on June 16th was brutal and chaotic. Blücher's Prussians fought stubbornly, their infantry clinging to villages and farmyards under relentless French artillery fire. Napoleon committed his Imperial Guard late in the day, smashing through the Prussian center and forcing Blücher's army into retreat. But the victory was incomplete. Blücher, though wounded and nearly captured, managed to withdraw in good order, maintaining cohesion and promising Wellington that he would return to the field. At the same time, Ney fought Wellington's advance elements to a standstill at Quatre-Bras, failing to deliver the decisive blow that might have severed the Allied armies completely. Napoleon's plan had succeeded in principle. He had divided his enemies and struck hard, but the execution fell just short of the crushing victories he needed. The Prussians were bloodied but unbroken. Wellington remained in the field. And now, the coalition commanders were determined to regroup and stand together. Still, Napoleon pressed on. He believed time was still on his side, that another rapid strike could finish the job before the enemy recovered. "We must attack before they unite," he told his marshals on the night of June 17th. The rain that fell across the Belgian plains could slow his guns. The mud could bog down his cavalry. But he would not stop. This was his last gamble, one more lightning blow to reclaim the empire he had built. He was betting everything on one more decisive victory. And the next day, on a low ridge near a village called Waterloo, he would discover whether the old magic still remained. In the days after the clashes at Quatre-Bras and Ligny, Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, found himself balancing caution and necessity. The Allied army under his command had held its ground against Marshal Ney's repeated assaults, but the situation remained precarious. Blücher's Prussians had suffered a setback at Ligny, yet had not been destroyed, retreating northward with the promise of regrouping. The key now was time. Time for the Prussians to recover and rejoin the fight. Time to prepare a position where Napoleon's momentum could be blunted and his fury absorbed. That meant choosing the ground with the precision of a chess player, selecting the square on which to make his final stand. Wellington understood that the terrain would decide everything. Against Napoleon's veteran army, the Anglo-Allied force was an uneven mix of British regulars, Dutch-Belgian conscripts, Hanoverian levies, and German contingents. Many were inexperienced and untested in battle. The Duke could not afford to meet the French on open ground where their artillery and cavalry might crush his lines before the Prussians arrived. Instead, he needed a position that would turn the geography itself into a weapon, one that would absorb French strength and buy him the hours necessary for Blücher's arrival. On the morning of June 17th, under gray skies and relentless rain, Wellington rode out from Brussels with his staff. The roads were a mire of mud and broken wagons, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and gunpowder. As they passed through the village of Waterloo, the landscape unfolded before him. Undulating farmland dotted with hedgerows, orchards, and small farmsteads. It was here, just south of the village, that he found what he was looking for, a long, shallow ridge near the hamlet of Mont-Saint-Jean. To the untrained eye, it was unremarkable, a gentle rise barely noticeable from a distance. But to a commander steeped in the art of defensive warfare, it was a gift. The ridge sloped gradually downward to the south, providing natural cover from French artillery fire. Troops deployed behind it would be largely invisible to the enemy until they crested the slope to fire, minimizing casualties during the bombardment that Wellington knew would precede any French attack. Beyond that, the reverse slope tactic, a hallmark of his Peninsular War campaigns, will allow his infantry to remain shielded and steady while French columns advance blind, only to be struck by sudden, concentrated volleys at close range. The position offered other advantages as well. Several sturdy farmhouses dotted the landscape, each of which could be fortified into miniature fortresses. On the western flank stood Hougoumont, a large walled estate surrounded by orchards and woods, an ideal anchor point for repelling flanking attacks. Near the center lay Haye Sainte, a stone farmhouse that could serve as a stronghold in front of the main line. Further east, the farms of Pays-Plate and La Haye provided similar defensive depth. Together, these strong points would form a defensive web, forcing the French to fight for every inch of ground while exhausting their strength long before they reached the main ridge. Wellington's choice of position was not merely tactical, but psychological. By taking up a strong defensive line so close to Brussels, only about 13 miles away, he signaled to his troops, his allies, and his enemies that there would be no retreat. This was where the coalition would stand and fight. It was also a calculated risk. Should Napoleon break through, the road to Brussels would lie open, and the political consequences would be catastrophic. But Wellington was confident in his judgment. He had chosen ground that would maximize his army's strengths: discipline, steadiness under fire, and coordinated volley fire, while neutralizing the speed and aggression that were the hallmarks of Napoleonic warfare. As evening fell on June 17th, the Allied army began to assemble along the ridge. Men dug shallow trenches, piled earthworks, and fortified the farmhouses under driving rain. Wagons struggled to the mud with ammunition and supplies, while artillery crews manhandled their guns into position behind the crest. Wellington himself moved among the troops, offering brief words of encouragement, his calm demeanor a steadying presence amid the storm. He knew that by dawn, Napoleon would be ready to attack, and the ground he had chosen would either hold or collapse under the greatest army Europe had ever seen. Across the valley, French scouts reported the Allied position to Napoleon, who examined it with a practiced eye. He recognized its strength, but dismissed its significance. He had broken strong positions before, and believed he would do so again. Yet in that subtle rise of land, in the hedgerows and farm walls, lay the seeds of his undoing. Wellington's choice was not just about defense. It was about shaping the battle itself. The ridge would dictate the terms of combat, forcing the French to fight on its conditions. And as the rain-soaked night settled over Mont-Saint-Jean, it was already clear that the fate of empires would be decided on that quiet stretch of Belgian farmland. The night of June 17, 1815, descended over the Belgian countryside not with the quiet solemnity of a battlefield eve, but with the relentless weight of a storm. From the moment the sun dipped beneath the horizon, rain fell in sheets, hammering the fields and turning every road, every path, and every hollow into rivers of thick, clinging mud. The sky itself seemed to press downward, heavy and oppressive, as thunder rolled over the ridgeline near Mont-Saint-Jean, where the Anglo-Allied army was taking position. Soldiers who had marched for days without rest now found themselves struggling to sleep in drenched uniforms, their tents sagging and leaking, the ground beneath them a sodden mess. It was not the night anyone had hoped for before the great confrontation that would decide the fate of Europe. Wellington moved among his troops in the downpour, his cloak soaked through, but his demeanor as composed as ever. He had seen too many campaigns to be unnerved by rain. If anything, the storm was an ally. The mud would slow Napoleon's vaunted artillery and blunt the speed of his cavalry, robbing the French of their most devastating advantages. The Duke understood that his army, a mixture of British regulars, Dutch and Belgian contingents, and German auxiliaries, was less reliant on rapid maneuver and more capable of holding firm under static conditions. If the weather turned the field into a quagmire, so be it. The ridge would still stand, and so would the men defending it. Across the valley, the French camp endured its own misery. Napoleon's soldiers, though hardened by years of war, found little comfort under the relentless rain. Their uniforms were soaked, their powder damp, and their horses struggled to remain upright in the deepening mud. Fires sputtered and died in the wind, leaving men huddled together for warmth, gnawing on hard bread and cold meat. The emperor himself was restless, pacing beneath his field tent and studying maps lit by flickering lanterns. The weather, he knew, was a formidable enemy, one that could ruin the carefully orchestrated tempo of his campaign. His artillery, the god of war that had shattered so many enemy lines, would be far less effective if the ground refused to support the recoil or the wheels of the heavy guns. His cavalry, too, would find it difficult to charge across waterlogged fields, their horses bogged down before they could build momentum. Yet Napoleon remained confident. He believed the storm would pass by morning, and when it did, the ground would firm enough for his army to deliver a decisive blow. His scouts had reported that Wellington was positioned defensively and did not intend to attack. That suited the emperor perfectly. He would dictate the rhythm of the battle, launch the assault when and where he chose, and crush the coalition army before the Prussians could rejoin it. The night's discomfort was, in his mind, a small price to pay for the victory that awaited. For the common soldiers of both armies, the night dragged on without rest. Rainwater pooled in trenches and seeped into boots, soaking feet that were already blistered from endless marching. Men shared scraps of dry food and muttered about the battle they knew was coming, some with bravado, others with quiet dread. The sound of distant musket fire and horses shifting uneasily in the dark reminded them that the enemy was not far away. Here and there, lanterns flickered like fireflies across the landscape, marking sentry posts and bivouacs, but otherwise the world was reduced to darkness, mud, and the drumbeat of rain on canvas. Wellington, ever the strategist, spent part of the night reviewing his positions. The reverse slope tactic would shield his troops from the opening bombardment, and his strong points, Hougoumont on the right, Haye Sainte in the center, and Papelotte on the left, were manned and fortified. He had confidence in his defensive plan, but much depended on timing. If Blucher's Prussians arrived too late, his army might buckle under the weight of French assaults. If they arrived on time, the balance would tilt decisively in the coalition's favor. His orders to his commanders were clear. Hold the line, no matter the cost, until the Prussians appeared on the field. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, the rain had finally eased, leaving behind a landscape transformed. The fields were deep and treacherous, every step sucking at boots and hooves, every wheel of a gun carriage struggling to move forward. Mist clung low to the ground, shrouding the ridge and the valley below in ghostly silence. It was a world made heavy and slow, not the fast, mobile battlefield Napoleon had hoped for. But both armies were now locked into their positions, their destinies entwined. The storm had passed, but the tension it left behind was palpable. Every man knew that when the clouds finally broke, the next storm would come not from the sky, but from cannon and musket. And when it did, the fields of Waterloo would become the crucible in which empires lived or died. The landscape south of the small Belgian village of Waterloo looked, at first glance, unremarkable. Gently rolling farmland stretched out in every direction, dotted with orchards, hedgerows, and clusters of low farm buildings. Yet on this ground, so ordinary and quiet beneath the early light of June 18th, 1815, the fate of empires would be decided. Wellington had spent the previous days studying every fold and feature of this terrain, and by the time his army had settled into position, the battlefield itself had become a vital part of his plan. Where Napoleon relied on overwhelming firepower and aggressive maneuver, Wellington would make the land his ally, shaping it into a trap that would blunt the force of French arms and exhaust their strength before they reached his main line. At the heart of his defensive position was the ridge near Mont-Saint-Jean, a shallow rise that stretched across the field in a broad arc. It was not a dramatic feature, barely noticeable from a distance, but its gentle slope held enormous tactical value. Wellington understood the power of artillery and the havoc it could wreak on infantry caught in the open. He had seen entire formations shredded by cannon fire in Spain and Portugal. Here, he would deny Napoleon that advantage. By deploying the bulk of his infantry on the reverse slope, just behind the crest of the ridge, he concealed them from French gunners. From a French position on the opposite side of the valley, the Allied army seemed sparse and scattered. In reality, tens of thousands of men were crouched just out of sight, their red and blue uniforms hidden behind the rise, waiting for the moment when they would emerge and deliver devastating volleys at close range. The ridge was not Wellington's only asset. Scattered across the battlefield were 3 key farm complexes, each of which he transformed into strong points anchoring his defensive line. On his right flank, about 400 yards forward of the ridge, stood Hougoumont, a large walled estate surrounded by gardens, orchards, and a small wood. Wellington knew it was likely to draw a significant portion of Napoleon's assault, so he garrisoned it with elite British Guards regiments and Nassau troops. The high walls and stout gates made it a natural fortress, and he ordered it to be held at all costs. Its defense would become one of the bloodiest and most heroic episodes of the battle. In the center, directly in front of his main line, lay Haye Sainte, a stone farmhouse positioned astride the Brussels road. Wellington recognized its strategic importance immediately. If it fell, the French would have a direct path toward the heart of his army. He stationed German troops of the King's German Legion inside and around the building, reinforcing doors and windows, piling ammunition and preparing for a siege. Its defenders would have to withstand hours of relentless assault, but their resistance could hold the center intact long enough for the tide of battle to turn. On the left flank, further east, stood the farms of Peyplate and La Haye, which formed the final anchors of the Allied position. These were garrisoned by Dutch and Nassau troops, tasked with protecting the flank and maintaining contact with the approaching Prussian army. Their defense would prove critical once Blücher's forces began to arrive, turning what could have been an exposed position into a hinge for the coalition counterattack. Wellington's deployment reflected not only his defensive genius, but also his deep understanding of Napoleon's methods. He knew the French emperor would attempt to pound his line into submission with artillery before launching massive infantry assaults in dense columns, followed by crushing cavalry charges. By concealing his infantry behind a ridge, he deprived the French gunners of clear targets, forcing them to waste shot and shell on empty ground. The psychological effect was equally important. French commanders, accustomed to seeing enemy lines crumble under bombardment, found themselves baffled when their cannonade failed to produce the usual chaos. It was as if their fire had vanished into the earth. The placement of strong points forward the main line added another layer to the trap. Napoleon would have to commit large numbers of troops to capture them, slowing his advance and scattering his forces before they reached the ridge. Every assault on Hougoumont, La Haye Sainte, or Peuplate would drain French manpower and buy Wellington more time. Time for Prussians to arrive, time for the French to tire, and time for his carefully prepared line to hold. By dawn, as the rain clouds lifted and mist rolled across the fields, the battlefield had taken on the shape of a great defensive machine. Every wall, every hedgerow, and every hollow had been turned to Wellington's advantage. His men were not simply waiting for French. They were embedded within the landscape itself, invisible and immovable. From Napoleon's vantage point, the Allied army looked thin and disorganized, an opponent ripe for destruction. But the reality was far more dangerous. Beneath the calm surface of the ridge, a deadly trap awaited. One that would soon test the very core of French military power and prove that terrain, patience, and discipline could stand against even the mightiest of empires. The morning of June 18th, 1815, dawned under a pale sky still heavy with the aftermath of the storm. Mist clung to the fields, and water pooled in the ruts carved by wagons and artillery wheels. As the sun slowly broke through the clouds, revealing the valley between Napoleon's army and Wellington's ridge, the first sounds of battle began to stir. It started not with the thunder of cannon or the march of massed infantry, but with movement toward a walled farmhouse on the Allied right, a place called Hougoumont. What followed would become one of the most savage and decisive struggles of the entire day, a battle within a battle that would consume thousands of lives and shape the course of the fight before it had truly begun. Napoleon had intended Hougoumont to serve as a diversion. By attacking this state, he hoped to draw Wellington's reserves away from the center, making it easier to break through later. At around 11:30 a.m., the order was given, and cannon fire opened across the valley. French skirmishers pushed forward to the woods and orchards surrounding the estate, followed by larger formations under the command of Prince Jerome Bonaparte, the emperor's younger brother. But what was meant as a limited operation quickly escalated beyond anyone's control. Hougoumont was no ordinary farmhouse. Enclosed by high brick walls and stout wooden gates, it was more fortress than farm. Inside, British guardsmen, Coldstream and Scots guards among them, alongside soldiers from the King's German Legion and Nassau regiments, had spent the night preparing for the inevitable assault. They piled ammunition, reinforced doors, and cut firing slits into the walls. Wellington himself had stressed its importance, calling it the key to the entire position. If Hougoumont fell, the French would be able to roll up the Allied right flank. If it held, it would bleed Napoleon's army of men and momentum. The first waves of French light infantry surged through the surrounding orchard, muskets cracking as they tried to gain a foothold. The defenders fired from windows, loopholes, and behind hastily built barricades, their volleys cutting down attackers who stumbled over fallen branches and mud-slick ground. The fighting quickly turned into a brutal close-quarters struggle, with bayonets flashing and musket butts used as clubs. Again and again, French troops attempted to scale the walls or force the gates, and again they were thrown back. At one point, a detachment of French soldiers managed to batter open the north gate and pour into the courtyard. For a few moments, it seemed Hougoumont might fall. But British guardsmen, led by officers wielding sword and pistols, counterattacked with ferocity, slamming the gates shut behind them and trapping those who had entered. Every Frenchman inside the walls was cut down. The defense became legendary, and one officer would later write that the closing of the gates decided the fate of the battle. As the hours dragged on, the scale of the engagement grew far beyond what Napoleon had intended. Entire brigades were committed to the assault, drawn into the maelstrom around the farmhouse. Cannon fire from both sides turned the surrounding orchard into a blasted wasteland. Flames licked at the wooden outbuildings as shells set them alight, choking the defenders with smoke even as they fought on. Casualties mounted rapidly, and still the French came. By early afternoon, more than 10,000 French troops had been thrown against Hougoumont. Yet the garrison, numbering barely a fraction of that, refused to yield. Wellington, observing the fight from the ridge, refused to reinforce the defenders beyond what was necessary. He had no intention of letting Napoleon's diversion drain his reserves. Instead, he allowed Hougoumont to become a deadly magnet, pulling French troops and resources away from the main effort. What had been designed as a feint was now a costly, all-consuming battle that sapped French strength hour by hour. For the men inside, the ordeal was relentless. Water and ammunition ran low, Bodies piled in the courtyards, and wounded soldiers were dragged into cellars and barns under fire. Yet their resolve never broke. British and German troops fought shoulder to shoulder, firing until their muskets grew too hot to hold, then reloading and firing again. French soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, began to falter as the afternoon wore on. The cries of "Vive l'Empereur" that had once accompanied their charges grew quieter, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the roar of cannon from the distant main line. By the time the sun began its slow descent, Hougoumont still stood. It was blackened by fire and littered with the dead, but the tricolor flag of France did not fly above its walls. What was meant to be a distraction had instead become a drain on Napoleon's strength and a symbol of Allied defiance. The defense of Hougoumont had tied down thousands of French troops, preventing them from being used elsewhere on the battlefield. It had also given Wellington a crucial psychological edge. The right flank had held. The line had not bent, and the first test of the day had ended in failure for the French. The battle was far from over, but as smoke drifted above the ruined farmhouse, one thing was clear. Wellington's plan was working. By early afternoon on June 18th, the thunder of musket fire around Hougoumont had begun to fade into a grim, constant background noise. The first phase of the battle had failed to yield a breakthrough, and Napoleon, watching from his command post near La Belle Alliance, knew it was time to bring the full weight of French firepower to bear. If the stubborn Allied defenders would not be drawn out by diversion, they would be pounded into submission. At his order, the most formidable weapon in his arsenal, the Grand Battery, was ready to speak. Across the French lines, gunners sprang into action, dragging heavy 12-pounders and howitzers into position. Soon, more than 70 cannon were arrayed in a long, smoking line along the crest of the slope opposite Wellington's Ridge. This was the method that had shattered enemy formations from Austerlitz to Friedland. French artillery, massed and concentrated, had long been the hammer with which Napoleon broke the enemy's shield. The gunners worked with practiced precision, ramming charges, setting fuses, and sighting their targets across the valley. The order was given, and with a rolling crack that shook the air itself, the first volley roared into the sky. Cannonballs screamed over the field, shell bursts rippled through the mist, and the earth trembled beneath the weight of the bombardment. For nearly an hour, the French guns hurled destruction toward the Allied position. The ground between the armies became a churning sea of smoke and mud, pockmarked by craters and scattered with splintered debris. The noise was deafening, a relentless percussion that seemed to shake the very bones of the men waiting beneath it. Yet for all its fury, the bombardment was accomplishing far less than Napoleon intended. Wellington's tactical decision to deploy much of his infantry behind the crest of the ridge now paid off in full. From a French perspective, the Allied line appeared thin and vulnerable, its true strength hidden from view. The gunners aimed at where they believed the enemy stood, but their cannonballs arced over the rise and crashed into the reverse slope beyond, where there was little to hit but mud and empty fields. Shells exploded harmlessly behind the British formations, and rounds shot-plowed furrows in the earth far beyond the men they were meant to kill. The soldiers waiting behind the ridge could hear the shrieking iron passing overhead, feel the ground shudder with each distant impact, and taste the acrid gunpowder that drifted on the wind. But they remained steady. They were veterans of Peninsular War, men who had stood firm under worse bombardments than this. Officers moved calmly along the ranks, reassuring their men and reminding them to stay down until the order came. Occasionally a shot fell short or a shell burst closer than expected, scattering dirt and shrapnel across the ranks. But discipline held. There was no panic, no collapse, only patience and the steady confidence of soldiers who knew their commander had chosen his ground well. Across the field, French officers grew frustrated. Reports came in that the bombardment was inflicting far fewer casualties than expected. The ground, still waterlogged from the previous night's rain, compounded the problem. Cannonballs that might have ricocheted deadly through enemy formations instead sank into mud with dull thuds, their kinetic energy spent. Even those that struck the ridge often buried themselves harmlessly in the soft soil. The devastation Napoleon had counted on, the shattered ranks, the broken morale, the collapse of discipline, never materialized. Still, the Emperor pressed on. He believed that even if the guns were not killing large numbers of enemy troops, they were at least softening their resolve, shaking their nerves, and preparing the way for the infantry assault that would follow. The smoke from the guns thickened, drifting like a gray curtain over the valley. Beneath it, the French infantry began to form up in great columns, ready to surge forward once the cannonade ceased. For men of the Allied army, the bombardment was a test of nerves as much as of endurance. They crouched silently on the reverse slope, listening to the relentless roar and waiting for the storm to end. The ridge shielded them from sight and spared them the worst of the destruction, but they knew the reprieve was temporary. When the guns fell silent, it would mean the French infantry was coming. Tens of thousands of them, advancing with drums beating and bayonets fixed. When at last the Grand Battery began to quiet, the valley was cloaked in smoke and littered with iron. The French gunners had fired thousands of rounds, yet Wellington's army still stood, largely unbroken and almost entirely unseen. The great bombardment, meant to shatter the Allied line, had instead revealed the first cracks in Napoleon's plan. His artillery had thundered across the valley, but its power had been blunted by terrain, weather, and the cunning simplicity of Wellington's deployment. The ground that was supposed to magnify French strength had, instead, betrayed it. And now, with the guns falling silent, the next phase of the battle was about to begin. The clash of men against men, steel against discipline, ambition against patience. As the smoke in the Grand Battery began to thin and the thunder of artillery gave way to a tense, heavy silence, a new sound rippled through the French lines, the beat of drums and the shouted command of officers rallying their men to advance. This was the moment Napoleon had been waiting for. The guns had spoken, and now the infantry would finish the work. Across the valley floor, Marshal Jean-Baptiste d'Erlin prepared his I Corps for the decisive assault. More than 17,000 men, veterans of countless campaigns, formed into massive attack columns, their bayonets glinting faintly through the haze. The order to move was given, and with a great shout, the columns surged forward, banners snapping in the damp wind. French tactics favored the use of dense, deep formations, designed to smash through enemy lines with sheer weight and momentum. d'Erlin's divisions advanced in perfect order, their drums keeping time as they marched steadily uphill toward Wellington's position. The sight was terrifying, great blocks of men moving as one, bayonets angled like a forest of steel, their tricolor flags rising and falling with the terrain. To the men watching from the British ridge, it looked like an unstoppable tide. Wellington's troops, however, did not move. They had been drilled for this moment, taught to hold their fire until the enemy was close enough for every shot to count. Behind the crest of the ridge, they waited in eerie silence, muskets loaded and bayonets fixed, their faces calm and set. Officers paced behind the lines, reminding their men to stay low and conserve ammunition. A few nervous jokes passed down the ranks, but mostly there was silence, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. As the French neared the crest, their columns began to fan out slightly, preparing to deploy into line and deliver volleys of their own. But they were already losing cohesion. The ground, still sodden from the night's rain, slowed their pace and broke their formations. Skirmishers on the flanks exchanged scattered shots with Allied light infantry, and French casualties began to mount before they even reached musket range. Still, they pressed on, confident that weight of numbers and the momentum of their advance would carry them through. Then, suddenly, the ridge came alive. As the leading French units crested the rise, the waiting British infantry stood up as one and leveled their muskets. Officers shouted the order, and a thunderous volley erupted along the Allied line. The effect was immediate and devastating. Entire files of French soldiers crumpled under the storm of lead, their ranks torn apart in seconds. The men behind stumbled over the fallen, struggling to keep formation as more volleys followed in disciplined succession. The British fired with deadly precision, each rank stepping forward to discharge their muskets before stepping back to reload, creating a seamless, rolling wall of fire. The French tried to respond with musketry of their own, but the density of their formations turned the slaughter against them. Every bullet fired into the packed columns found its mark, while the thinner British lines presented far smaller targets. The front of the French assault began to waver, men ducking instinctively under the relentless volleys. Officers shouted for them to press forward, waving their swords and trying to reform the ranks, but the ground was slick with mud and bodies, and progress slowed to a crawl. At that critical moment, Wellington unleashed his next blow. British heavy cavalry, hidden behind the ridge, suddenly appeared on the crest and charged down the slope into the disordered French infantry. The Union Brigade, the Scots Greys, the Inniskillings, and the Royal Dragoons smashed in the flanks of D'Erlin's columns with irresistible force. Horses crashed into men, sabers cut through muskets and bayonets, and panic spread to the French ranks. What had been an orderly advance dissolved into chaos. Soldiers threw down their weapons and tried to flee back down the hill, only to be cut down or trampled underfoot. The scene was one of brutal, swirling combat. French eagles, the proud standards of the regiments, were captured amid the melee, torn from the hands of their defenders. The momentum of the Union Brigade carried them deep into enemy lines, slicing the great columns apart and scattering them across the field. It was a devastating blow. D'Erlin's corps, which had begun the assault with confidence and precision, now streamed back toward the French lines in disorder, leaving behind thousands of dead and wounded. Yet the cost for the British cavalry was high as well. In their enthusiasm, many of the horsemen pursued too far and were counterattacked by French lancers, suffering heavy casualties before retreating. Even so, the damage was done. The grand infantry assault, the heart of Napoleon's plan, had failed. The ridge still held. The Allied line remained unbroken, and the French were forced to regroup under heavy fire. As smoke drifted over the blood-soaked slopes and the cries of the wounded filled the valley, it was clear that the tide of battle had not turned in Napoleon's favor. The British had met the French columns with iron discipline and devastating firepower, and the result was a rout. The Emperor had thrown his might against Wellington's position, and the ridge, silent and unshaken, had thrown it back. The British infantry's disciplined volleys had done their work. D'Erlin's massive assault columns, once so formidable and confident, now faltered under the storm of musket fire cascading down from Wellington's ridge. Order dissolved into confusion as men stumbled over fallen comrades, tripped in the mud, and clutched at the wounds tearing through their ranks. The rhythm of their advance was broken, their momentum lost. It was precisely the moment Wellington had been waiting for. On the crest of the ridge, the heavy cavalry of the British Army, the pride of its mounted arm, received the order they had been itching to hear. Trumpets blared, sabers flashed in the pale light, and with a surge of raw power the horsemen began their descent. The Union Brigade, named for the nationalities it represented, English, Scottish, and Irish regiments, was among the most feared cavalry forces in Europe. The Scots Greys, their helmets topped with flowing bearskins, formed the Hard Brigade, supported by the Royal Dragoons and the Inniskilling Dragoons. These were not light raiders or skirmishers. They were heavy cavalry, big men on massive horses, their sabers designed not for finesse, but for sheer, crushing impact. As they gathered speed down the slope, the ground seemed to tremble beneath the combined weight of horse and rider. The French infantry, already disorganized and struggling to maintain formation under relentless fire, had little time to react. Shouts of alarm rippled through their lines as the drumming of hoofs grew louder, swelling from a distant thunder into a roar. Officers screamed for squares to be formed, the classic defense against cavalry. But there was no time. The formations were too deep, too scattered, too broken to respond. A heartbeat later, the Union Brigade was among them. The impact was devastating. Horses crashed into the front ranks, flinging men aside like rag dolls. British sabers flashed in sweeping arcs, hacking through muskets and bayonets, cutting down anyone who stood in their path. Soldiers who moments earlier had been pressing uphill with grim determination now broke and ran, their discipline shattered by the sudden, terrifying presence of steel and muscle bearing down on them. French eagles, the symbolic standards of the regiments, were wrenched from their bearers and held aloft as trophies. Entire battalions were scattered, their remnants streaming back down the slope in panic. For a time, the battlefield belonged to the British cavalry. They cut a swath through D'Erlin's battered corps, trampling over gun crews, overrunning artillery positions, and slicing through retreating infantry. Officers urged restraint, shouting for men to reform and pull back to safety, but the momentum of the charge carried them forward. In the chaos of victory, discipline began to fray. The exhilaration of pursuit, the intoxicating sense of invincibility, pushed many riders beyond their orders. What had begun as a perfectly timed counterattack now became a dangerous overextension. The cavalry thundered far beyond protective cover of the Allied infantry and into the open valley, where they were exposed and vulnerable. It was here, in the broken ground near the French lines, that the tide turned against them. Napoleon's cavalry reserves, squadrons of lancers and cuirassiers, were waiting. As the British horsemen pursued their scattered enemies, the French countercharge slammed into their flanks with brutal precision. The lancers, with their long spears designed specifically to unseat mounted opponents, proved especially deadly. They darted into the gaps between the exhausted British troopers, striking men from their saddles and impaling horses mid-charge. The Scots Greys, so formidable in their initial assault, found themselves surrounded and fighting desperately to break free. Dragoons, who had moments before been triumphant, now struggled simply to survive, hacking their way back toward their own lines through a storm of steel. The retreat was chaotic and costly. Many of the cavalrymen who had ridden down the slope so confidently did not return. Hundreds were killed, wounded, or captured, and several regiments were effectively rendered combat ineffective for the remainder of the battle. Yet despite these heavy losses, the damage they had inflicted on the French was immense. Durlin SI Corps, the main thrust of Napoleon's first great assault, lay shattered. Thousands of French infantrymen were dead or routed, their attack broken before it could breach Wellington's line. Wellington himself understood both the brilliance and the peril of what had just occurred. The charge had been spectacular, one of the most dramatic moments of the battle, but it had also come dangerously close to disaster. Had the French cavalry been stronger or their timing slightly better, the overextended British horsemen might have been annihilated entirely. Even so, the strategic effect was undeniable. The immediate threat to the Allied center had been repelled, and Napoleon's plans for a rapid breakthrough lay in ruins. As the surviving cavalry trickled back to their lines, many of them bloodied and exhausted, the field was littered with evidence of their charge: shattered bayonets, broken guns, trampled flags, and the bodies of friend and foe alike. It had been a moment of glory and a sobering lesson in equal measure. The Union Brigade had shown the power of a well-timed cavalry strike, but they had also revealed how quickly triumph could turn to peril when the thirst for victory overcame discipline. For now, though, Wellington's ridge still held firm, and Napoleon's second great blow had been turned aside. As the afternoon wore on, the roar of battle over the fields of Waterloo refused to fade. The great infantry assault had been shattered, and the heavy cavalry clash had left the valley strewn with bodies and broken weapons. But the fight was far from over. Napoleon, unwilling to concede the initiative, shifted his focus toward the heart of Wellington's line, a seemingly unremarkable farmhouse called Haye Sainte. Its stone walls and sturdy outbuildings stood just forward the Allied ridge, directly astride the Brussels road, and though small in scale, its position was vital. Whoever controlled it would command a direct approach into the center of the Anglo-Allied line. For Wellington, it was a bulwark. For Napoleon, it was a doorway. Inside Haye Sainte were roughly 400 men of the King's German Legion, German troops loyal to the British Crown, veterans of the Peninsular War renowned for their discipline and tenacity. Under Major George Baring, they had fortified the farmhouse as best they could, blocking doors, barricading windows, and stockpiling ammunition. Their orders were simple and uncompromising: hold the position as long as humanly possible. The surrounding area had become a killing ground, swept by artillery fire and musketry from both sides, but the defenders understood the stakes. If the farm fell, the French would have a clear path into Wellington Center, a path that could split the Allied army in two. The first French attacks came shortly after 2 p.m. skirmishers and Voltigas advanced cautiously, probing the defenses, firing into windows, and trying to set the wooden gates alight. Each time they approached, the Germans inside unleashed disciplined volleys that sent them scrambling for cover. For a time, the stone walls seemed impregnable, and the French were forced to pull back and regroup. But Napoleon was determined. He knew that without Haye Sainte, his chances of breaking the Allied center were slim. He ordered repeated assaults, throwing more men into the fight with each attempt. By mid-afternoon, the battle around the farmhouse had become savage and relentless. French infantry swarmed forward in waves, using bayonets and axes to try to force their way through doors and windows. The Germans fired until their muskets grew hot to the touch, then fixed bayonets and met their attackers in brutal hand-to-hand combat inside the narrow rooms and courtyards. Smoke and fire choked the air as musket balls ricocheted off stone walls and cannonballs slammed into the surrounding structures. The fighting was so close that soldiers could hear their enemies' breath, could see the flash of fear and fury in their eyes. But as the hours dragged on, a new and more dangerous problem emerged for defenders. Ammunition was running low. The King's German Legion had been isolated since the start of the battle, and resupply was impossible under the constant rain of French fire. One by one, the muskets fell silent as cartridges were spent. Men resorted to stripping ammunition from the dead or fighting with bayonets and the butts of their weapons. The French, sensing the weakening resistance, intensified their assault. By early evening, the inevitable happened. French troops finally broke through the battered gates and poured into the courtyard. The defenders, exhausted and nearly out of ammunition, fought with bayonets and knives in desperate close-quarters combat, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Major Bering, realizing further resistance would mean annihilation, ordered a withdrawal. The surviving Germans fell back toward the main Allied line, leaving Haye Sainte in French hands. The capture of the farm sent a ripple of alarm through Wellington's army. For the first time all day, a breach had opened in the Allied position. French skirmishers and artillery quickly occupied the buildings, using the cover of the stone walls to fire directly into the British line on the ridge. Cannon were brought forward and began blasting gaps in infantry formations. For a moment, it seemed the balance of the battle had shifted decisively. Napoleon seized on the opportunity, ordering more troops toward the center in an attempt to exploit the gap before Wellington could react. On the ridge, the situation grew dire. Officers shouted orders to redeploy units and plug the hole in the line, while messengers galloped off to summon reserves. British and Dutch infantry hurried to form new defensive positions behind the ridge, bracing for the renewed assault that was sure to follow. Wellington himself rode along the front, calm and composed, reassuring his men even as the French cannonballs tore into the earth around them. The fall of Haye Sainte was more than just a tactical setback. It was a moment when the battle truly hung in the balance. Napoleon's men were now within striking distance of the heart of the Allied army, and if the next attack succeeded, the ridge might be lost and the road to Brussels thrown open. Yet, despite the gravity of the situation, the line did not break. The Allied troops held firm, their discipline unshaken, buying precious time as evening approached. In the fading light, as smoke drifted over the blood-soaked courtyard of the captured farmhouse, the outcome of the battle, and perhaps the fate of Europe, still hung in precarious uncertainty. As the afternoon deepened and smoke drifted low across the battlefield, confusion began to creep into the French command. The fighting around Haye Sainte had reached a fever pitch, and Napoleon's army had finally punched a hole in the Allied line, but the center had not collapsed as expected. Instead, the British and their allies continued to hold their positions, stubbornly refusing to yield the ridge. It was amid this haze of uncertainty that Marshal Michel Ney, Napoleon's most aggressive and impetuous marshal, made a fateful decision, one that would cost France dearly. Known throughout Europe as the bravest of brave, Ney had earned his reputation through years of reckless courage and daring leadership. But on June 18, 1815, that very quality became a liability. From his vantage point near the center of the French line, he believed he saw signs that Wellington's army was breaking. Clouds of dust rising behind the ridge, movement of supply wagons, and wounded heading toward the rear. To Ney, they looked like the beginnings of retreat. Convinced that the moment had come to finish the job, he acted without waiting for orders from Napoleon. The marshal ordered one of the most audacious and disastrous maneuvers of the day, a full-scale cavalry assault against the Allied center, without infantry, without artillery support, and without proper reconnaissance. It was a decision born of impulse rather than strategy, and its consequences would soon become evident. The ground shook as thousands of French horsemen began their charge. Heavy cuirassiers and gleaming breastplates led the way, their polished armor flashing in the dim light, followed by dragoons, lancers, and carabineers. It was a magnificent and terrifying sight, a sea of cavalry surging forward across the muddy field, sabers drawn, standards flying, and trumpets blaring above the roar of hoofs. They advanced with deadly speed, their formation tightening as they closed the distance to the ridge. Wellington's infantry saw them coming. They had fought French cavalry before, and they knew exactly what to do. Officers barked orders, and long red-coated lines transformed into compact, bristling squares. Hollow boxes of men 4 ranks deep, bayonets angled outward like a forest of steel. Within these living fortresses, the colors and officers were protected in the center, while the outer ranks prepared to meet the storm. Muskets were loaded and leveled, and silence fell over the Allied lines as they waited for the inevitable impact. The French cavalry hit the squares with thunderous force, but the effect was far from what Ney intended. Horses balked at the wall of bayonets, rearing and swerving at the last moment, throwing their riders off balance. The men inside the squares unleashed devastating volleys at point-blank range, cutting down horse and rider alike. Cavalrymen tried to circle the squares, searching for a weak point, but disciplined British volleys followed them, firing from every side. The field was soon littered with dead horses and shattered armor, yet Ney, unwilling to admit defeat, sent them back and again. Time after time, the French cavalry regrouped and charged once more, spurred on by Ney's orders and their own determination to break the British line. But each assault met the same fate. The squares held firm, steady and unbroken amid the chaos. Whenever the cavalry drew back, Allied artillery crews rushed forward, pushing their guns into the open and blasting the retreating horsemen with canister shot before scrambling back to safety as another wave approached. The ridge became a slaughter ground, churned mud, twisted bodies, and mangled horses marking the price of Ney's impulsive decision. The scale of the attacks was staggering. More than 10,000 cavalrymen were committed in repeated waves, some charging as many as a dozen times. Yet the Allied infantry never wavered. The discipline of the British, Dutch, and German troops was absolute, and their formation, drilled and perfected over years of campaigning, proved impregnable. Even as casualties mounted inside the squares, the soldiers maintained their composure, reloading with methodical precision and firing into the masses of cavalry that swirled around them. Napoleon, observing the spectacle, could only watch in frustration as Ney's assaults consumed men and horses with no result. The marshal's misinterpretation of the situation had squandered one of the French army's most powerful assets. Without infantry to exploit any breach or artillery to weaken the squares before the charge, the cavalry alone could not break the Allied line. By the time Ney finally called off the attacks, the ground before Wellington's position was carpeted with the wreckage of his cavalry. Entire regiments were shattered, and the French army's momentum was gone. Worse still, the failed assaults had bought Wellington valuable time. Time for his troops to regroup and time for Blucher's Prussians, marching hard toward the battlefield, to close the distance. The repeated charges had been brave, even heroic, but they were also tragically misguided. Ney had thrown away thousands of lives in pursuit of an illusion, mistaking discipline for retreat and resolve for weakness. As the smoke cleared and the battered remnants of the French cavalry limped back to their lines, it was clear that the gamble had failed. Wellington Square still stood, unbroken, unyielding, and waiting for whatever else the Emperor had left to throw at them. Throughout the long afternoon at Waterloo, as infantry clashed, cavalry charged, and artillery thundered across the valley, one part of Napoleon's army remained conspicuously still. Behind the French center, near La Belle Alliance, thousands of soldiers stood in perfect formation, untouched by the chaos unfolding around them. These were the men of the Imperial Guard, the finest troops Napoleon had ever commanded, veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram, soldiers who had marched with him from the sands of Egypt to the snows of Russia. They were more than an elite reserve. They were a symbol of the empire itself, a living embodiment of its power and glory. And as long as they remained uncommitted, hope still flickered in the French ranks. The Guard's presence was a psychological weapon as much as a military one. Soldiers on both sides knew their reputation. They had never been routed in battle, and their mere advance was often enough to shatter enemy morale. Napoleon kept them deliberately in the rear, a coiled spring waiting for the right moment. It was a gamble he had played many times before, holding his best troops in reserve until the decisive point of the battle, then unleashing them in a crushing blow that would break the enemy's will. But at Waterloo, the situation was growing more complex by the hour, and the window for that decisive blow was narrowing. Despite repeated assaults, Wellington's line had not broken. The defense of Hougoumont had held the right flank. The infantry squares had repelled Ney's massive cavalry charges. Even the fall of Haye Sainte, which had exposed the Allied center to direct artillery fire, had failed to trigger a collapse. The British and their allies were battered and bloodied, but they were still standing. Their discipline and tenacity had absorbed everything Napoleon had thrown at them, and they showed no sign of giving way. It was in this tense and uncertain atmosphere that ominous news reached Napoleon's headquarters. Scouts reported movement on the eastern horizon, columns of troops marching rapidly toward the battlefield. At first, there was confusion. Could it be Grouchy, the Marshal Napoleon had sent with 30,000 men to pursue the Prussians after their defeat at Ligny? If Grouchy had turned back in time, he could fall upon the Allied flank and crush Wellington between two French armies. But as the reports grew clearer, hope gave way to grim realization. The advancing columns were not French. They were Prussians, and they were closing fast. The man leading them was Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, the indomitable commander who had been thrown back at Ligny only 2 days earlier, but had promised Wellington that he would return to the fight. True to his word, Blücher had regrouped his battered army and was now marching with all speed toward Waterloo. The arrival of his forces threatened to swing the balance decisively against Napoleon. If the Prussians linked up with Wellington before the French could win the battle, Napoleon would find himself facing not one army but two. The emperor's dilemma was clear. He could no longer wait indefinitely to commit his Imperial Guard. If he held them too long, they might be rendered irrelevant by the arrival of overwhelming enemy reinforcements. But if he threw them into fight too soon, they might be blunted against Wellington's still intact line and lost before they could deliver a decisive blow. For now, he chose to wait, but his options were shrinking with each passing minute. On the ridge, Wellington's men braced themselves for what they knew was coming. They could see the Guard waiting in the distance, their ranks gleaming in the fading light. Rumors rippled through the Allied line that Napoleon was preparing his final assault, that the Guard would soon advance, that the real battle had not yet begun. Officers walked the ranks, speaking in calm tones, urging their men to hold just a little longer. Every soldier understood the stakes. If they could endure this last storm, the arrival of the Prussians might seal victory. If they faltered, the battle, and perhaps Europe itself, would be lost. Meanwhile, on the eastern edge of the field, the first skirmishes between French outposts and Prussian vanguards began. Plumes of smoke rose from the village of Plancenoit as fighting erupted in the streets. Napoleon was forced to divert elements of his young guard and other reserves to hold the flank, weakening the forces he could bring to bear against Wellington. What had once been a straightforward confrontation was now becoming a two-front struggle, and time, the one element Napoleon could never command, was slipping away. Yet the Imperial Guard still waited, silent and unmoving, their eagles held high and their discipline unshaken. Their moment had not yet come, but when it did, it would be the final throw of the dice. For Napoleon, everything now depended on them. If they could break the Anglo-Allied line before Blücher's army arrived in full strength, the day might still be his. But if they failed, there would be no second chance. The empire, the legend, and perhaps the man himself would fall with them. By the time the sun began to sink toward the western horizon on June 18th, 1815, the fields of Waterloo were a landscape of exhaustion and ruin. The battle had raged for hours without a decisive breakthrough. French assaults had been repelled at Hougoumont, their columns shattered by musketry on the ridge, and their cavalry hurled back again and again from British squares. Yet Wellington's army was showing signs of strain. Ammunition was running low in many units. Casualties were mounting, and parts of the line were dangerously thin. Napoleon still believed that one last blow, perhaps delivered by the Imperial Guard, might win him the day. But then came the news he had been dreading all along. At around 4:30 in the afternoon, scouts reported movement to the east. At first, distant shapes were mistaken by some for Grouchy's force, the 30,000 men Napoleon had sent to pursue the Prussians after Ligny. If Grouchy had disengaged and was marching toward Waterloo, the French might yet win the battle by trapping Wellington between two French armies. But soon the unmistakable sound of distant cannon fire reached the ears of those on the field, and the black banners of the Prussian army appeared on the ridges beyond Plancenoit. It was not Grouchy. It was Blücher, and he had come as he had promised. The first Prussian troops to arrive were elements of General Bülow's 4 Corps, marching hard since dawn to reach the field in time. Exhausted but determined, they advanced toward the French right flank, where the village of Plancenoit stood as the key to Napoleon's position. If the Prussians could seize it, they would threaten the entire rear of the French army and cut off its line of retreat. The arrival of these fresh forces immediately shifted the balance of the battle. Napoleon, who had been preparing to commit his reserves against Wellington, now faced the terrifying prospect of being enveloped. The fighting around Plancenoit was fierce and desperate from the moment the Prussians closed in. The village, a cluster of stone houses, narrow streets, and churchyards, became a maze of death as French troops scrambled to hold it. Napoleon threw elements of his young Guard, among the finest troops still available to him, into the defense. These were soldiers who had grown up in the shadow of the Empire, fiercely loyal and determined to prove themselves worthy of the Imperial Guard's legacy. They fortified buildings, erected barricades, and fought from windows and doorways, pouring musket fire into the advancing Prussians. The Prussians responded in kind, storming the village with bayonets fixed and drums beating. House by house, street by street, the battle raged in close quarters. The church of Plancenoit became a focal point, changing hands multiple times as each side threw fresh troops into the struggle. Smoke and dust obscured the narrow lanes, and the screams of the wounded echoed through the village as bodies piled up in the gutters. Neither side was willing to yield. The French knew that the loss of Plancenoit would mean disaster. The Prussians knew that capturing it could decide the battle. Napoleon, realizing the severity of the situation, was forced to divert more and more troops to the east. Units he had intended to use for a decisive push against Wellington were now committed to holding back Blücher's advance. Even elements of the old Guard, the most elite soldiers in France, were sent in to fight, bayonets glinting as they counterattacked through the blood-soaked streets. For every yard gained, the Prussians paid a heavy price, but their numbers grew as more of Blücher's corps arrived on the field. Soon, elements of General Ziethen's I Corps were joining the fray, extending the Prussian line and intensifying pressure on the French flank. The strain on Napoleon's army became visible. His right wing, which had been relatively secure that morning, was now in peril. The constant stream of reinforcements sent to Plancenoit left fewer troops available to support Ney's battered cavalry or press the advantage in the center. Every minute the French spent fighting in the village was a minute Wellington used to stabilize his line and prepare for the final French assault. By early evening, the situation was critical. Although the French still held most of Plancenoit, their grip was tenuous. The Prussians continued to push forward, their determination fueled by vengeance for Ligny and their desire to end Napoleon's reign once and for all. In some areas, French defenders were forced back to the very edge of the village. At one point, Prussian artillery began shelling the outskirts of La Belle Alliance itself, threatening Napoleon's headquarters. What had once been a battle between two armies was now a struggle on two fronts. Napoleon was fighting not only Wellington's stubborn defense to the north, but also Blücher's relentless advance to the east. The arrival of the Prussians transformed Waterloo from a contest of strength into a race against time, one Napoleon could no longer afford to lose. And yet, even as the French fought desperately to hold Plancenoit, the Emperor prepared for his final gamble. If he could smash Wellington's center before the Prussians completely enveloped his army, there was still a chance to snatch victory from disaster. But with every volley fired and every street lost, that chance grew smaller, slipping through his fingers like sand. The sun hung low over the blood-soaked fields of Waterloo, casting long shadows across the ridge where Wellington's army still clung stubbornly to its ground. The day had been a storm of assaults and counter-assaults, of cavalry charges, artillery barges, and desperate hand-to-hand fighting. Yet neither side had delivered a decisive blow. Napoleon's men were exhausted, their ranks thinned by hours of relentless combat. The Prussians were tightening their grip on Plancenoit, threatening to envelop the French right. Time was slipping away. If the Emperor was to win, it would have to be now, with one final, desperate strike at the heart of the Allied line. And for that, he would turn to his last weapon, the Imperial Guard. The Guard had waited all day for this moment. These were the veterans of Austerlitz and Borodino, men who had marched across Europe under Napoleon's banner, who believed themselves invincible. They were the emperor's chosen, the embodiment of his power and prestige. Their presence alone had steadied the French army through the darkest hours of battle. Now, as twilight approached, they were ordered forward for one final assault, a strike that Napoleon hoped would shatter Wellington's weary line and turn the tide before Blucher's Prussians could finish their encirclement. Drums rolled and the cry of "Vive l'Empereur" swept down the French lines as the Guard advanced. 5 battalions, the cream of the Old and Middle Guard, stepped forward in perfect order, their ranks gleaming even in the fading light. Bayonets fixed, eagles held high. They marched steadily uphill toward the ridge, the sound of their approach cutting through the smoke and chaos of the field. French officers watched them with pride and relief. If anyone could break the Allied line, it was these men. Wellington, however, was ready. He had held back reserves for just this moment, positioning them behind the crest of the ridge. As the Guard drew nearer, the Allied line seemed to waver, then part, a trick designed to draw the French forward and expose them. From a French perspective, it appeared the British were finally breaking, retreating before the unstoppable advance of the Guard. Cheers rose from the French ranks. But then, just as the Guard crested the ridge and prepared to deliver the coup de grace, the hidden British infantry rose from behind the slope. Volley fire erupted along the line, a deafening crash of musketry that tore through the advancing columns. Whole ranks of the Guard went down in an instant, cut down by the disciplined fire of British and Allied troops. Officers shouted for their men to press on, but each step forward brought another devastating volley. The tight, proud formations began to falter under the withering fire, their momentum stalling as casualties mounted. Yet the Guard pushed on, determined to reach the crest and smash through the line. In the chaos, the British Guards Brigade under General Maitland delivered another crushing volley at point-blank range, followed by yet another. The French returned fire, but their deep columns were no match for the thin red lines firing in coordinated ranks. Smoke choked the hillside, and the shouts of officers were drowned out by the roar of musket fire and the screams of the wounded. The Guard tried to reform, but it was too late. The assault that had begun with such confidence now began to falter. Wellington seized the moment. Sensing the enemy's hesitation, he ordered a counterattack. British and Dutch infantry surged forward with bayonets fixed, slamming into the disordered French columns and driving them back down the slope. For the first time in the history of the Imperial Guard, their advance had been stopped cold. Officers tried desperately to rally the men, shouting that the Emperor was watching, but the tide had turned. As they fell back under relentless fire, a cry rose from the French ranks, a cry that would seal Napoleon's fate. La Garde, recule. The Guard is retreating. The word spread like wildfire across the battlefield. To the exhausted French soldiers still fighting around La Haye Sainte and Plancenoit, the news was unthinkable. The Guard, the Emperor's invincible elite, was falling back. If they could not break the Allied line, no one could. What had been stubborn resistance on Wellington's ridge now became a wave of renewed confidence. Allied troops cheered as the Guard withdrew, and British cavalry charged into collapsing French formations, adding to the chaos. Napoleon watched from a distance, silent and motionless. For years, the Guard had been his ultimate weapon, the guarantee of victory when all else had failed. Now, even they had been broken, the sight cut deeper than any defeat he had ever suffered. His last gamble had failed. The ridge still held. The Prussians were closing in, and the battle that was meant to restore his empire was slipping irretrievably from his grasp. As the remnants of the Imperial Guard fell back toward La Belle Alliance, the field dissolved into confusion. Orders went unheard, formations crumbled, and panic began to spread. The unthinkable had happened. The Emperor's most feared soldiers had been repulsed, and with them went the last hope of salvaging the day. The cries still echoed over the smoke-stained fields as night approached. La Garde, recule. And with those words, Napoleon's dream of resurrection died on the ridge at Waterloo, the cry that no French soldier had ever expected to hear. La Garde, recule, spread like wildfire across the battlefield. It began as a whisper among the ranks near the center, then rippled outward like a shock wave, shaking the confidence of men who had fought for hours under punishing fire. If the Imperial Guard, the Emperor's most invincible troops, could be stopped and forced back, then the battle was lost. It was more than a tactical setback. It was a psychological collapse. Across the field, men who had endured artillery barrages, charged uphill through mud, and faced down bayonets now felt the terrible weight of inevitability settle upon them. The myth of French invincibility, the aura that had carried Napoleon's armies from Madrid to Moscow, was gone in an instant. What followed was not an orderly withdrawal, but a disintegration. Cohesion evaporated as panic took hold. Regiments that had once marched with precision now stumbled backward in confusion. Officers shouted themselves hoarse trying to rally their men, waving swords and standards in a desperate attempt to restore order. Some soldiers turned and ran without waiting for orders. Others threw down their muskets. Too exhausted and demoralized continued the fight. The battlefield, already a wasteland of bodies and wreckage, became a scene of chaos as the French army began to crumble. Wellington, sensing the collapse, pressed the advantage. He ordered a general advance along the ridge, and the British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops who had spent the day fighting defensively now surged forward. Drums beat, bayonets gleamed in the fading light, and cheers erupted from the Allied lines. To the French, it felt like the ground itself was closing in. Every step backward invited pursuit. Every attempt to regroup was shattered by fresh volleys and renewed cavalry charges. The once proud Grande Armée was no longer a coordinated fighting force. It was a mass of fugitives trying to escape the slaughter. On the French right, the situation deteriorated even further as Blücher's Prussians swept onto field in greater strength. Having finally broken through the desperate French defense at Plancenoit, they poured into the open flank of Napoleon's army, striking like a hammer against an already crumbling wall. The combined pressure from the Allied front and the Prussian flank left the French with nowhere to go but backward. Soon, retreat became rout. Carts and artillery pieces were abandoned in the mud. Horses broke free from their handlers, and units disintegrated into scattered bands of survivors fleeing toward the south. In the midst of the chaos, Napoleon tried to salvage what he could. He rode among his men, urging them to stand and fight, but the old magic was gone. Soldiers who had once followed him across continents now looked to the ground, unwilling to meet his gaze. Even the remnants of the Imperial Guard, who had formed a rear guard to cover the retreat, knew the truth. Surrounded and outnumbered, they fought with grim determination, refusing surrender but unable to change the outcome. Their sacrifice bought time for Napoleon and parts of his staff to escape, but it could not save the army. As darkness fell over Waterloo, the scale of the disaster became clear. What had begun as a bold attempt to crush the coalition and restore France's dominance had ended in ruin. More than 40,000 French soldiers lay dead, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. The road south was choked with refugees, soldiers, camp followers, and civilians fleeing the advancing Allied armies. Napoleon, once the master of Europe, now fled toward Paris with a handful of loyal officers, leaving behind the wreckage of his final army and the shattered remnants of his dream. The political consequences were swift and brutal. News of the defeat reached Paris within days, and the reaction was immediate. The Chamber of Deputies, which had once cheered Napoleon's triumphant return from Elba, now turned against him. Realizing that the war was lost and that France itself was in danger of invasion, they forced him to abdicate a second time on June 22, 1815. This time there would be no exile to an island within sight of Europe. The British and their allies resolved to remove him from the continent entirely. In October, Napoleon was placed aboard HMS Northumberland and transported to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the rest of his life in isolation. The ridge at Waterloo, once just another patch of farmland, became something more that day. It was transformed into a symbol of discipline over fury, of resilience over ambition, and of the triumph of cooperation over conquest. The battle did not just end Napoleon's reign. It ended an era. For more than 2 decades, Europe had been shaped by the will of one man. Armies had marched across borders at his command. Kingdoms had risen and fallen at his whim, and the very map of the continent had been redrawn by his hand. Now, with his defeat, that chapter was closed. In the years that followed, Waterloo became shorthand for ultimate defeat, a name invoked whenever ambition outstripped reality. But for those who stood on that ridge in June 1815, it was more than a metaphor. It was the place where an empire crumbled, where legends were broken, and where the course of history turned. The guns fell silent as night swallowed the battlefield, but their echoes lingered, a reminder that even the mightiest can fall, and that no empire, however vast, is eternal.